The night had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that made every sound echo too loudly. Ethan sat behind the wheel of his dead car, the dashboard lights fading one by one until the only glow came from the moon above the open road. The wind brushed over the tall grass by the fence line, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. He checked his phone again. No signal. Just that mocking no service sign in the corner of the screen. He sighed, dropping the phone onto the passenger seat, feeling the weight of the day settle over him like the darkness itself. The argument with Ryan still rang in his head. It wasn't new. They'd been having the same conversation for months. Ethan wanted time, connection, something real beyond their shared apartment and shared schedules. Ryan wanted stability, structure, and for Ethan to stop overthinking everything. But what Ryan called stability felt more like distance. It had been months since they'd really seen each other, really looked at each other. And tonight's fight over something as small as a missed dinner plan had felt like the final straw. Now, stranded on a deserted highway miles outside of town, Ethan wasn't sure if the silence was punishment or mercy. He leaned his head against the cold window glass and exhaled. The sound fogged the glass for a moment before fading away. Then, far off in the distance, a pair of headlights appeared. Ethan straightened in his seat. The lights grew brighter, cutting through the darkness, until the shape of a pickup truck came into view. It slowed beside him, engine rumbling softly. A figure stepped out, tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a denim jacket that caught the faint light. "You stuck out here?" The man called, his voice calm, warm, and carrying a southern drawl that felt oddly reassuring. Ethan nodded, stepping out of the car. "Yeah, battery died. I think the tire's flat too." The stranger walked closer, his boots crunching on gravel. "Well, that's quite a night you're having," he said with a half-smile. "Name's Caleb. I live a few miles down the road. Got a tow line in the truck if you don't mind a bit of company." Ethan hesitated. The city in him said not to trust strangers, especially in the dark. But there was something steady in Caleb's tone. No rush, no threat, just quiet confidence. After a moment, he nodded. "I'd really appreciate that." Caleb got to work, his movements sure and practiced. The air smelled faintly of oil and pine. Ethan watched as he hooked up the tow line and tested the connection. "You're lucky I passed by," Caleb said. "Not much traffic this way after dark." "I guess I am," Ethan replied, forcing a small smile. When the car was secure, Caleb gestured toward the passenger seat of his truck. "Hop in, my ranch isn't far. You can rest there, and we'll get your car sorted in the morning." The truck's interior was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and leather. As they drove, the headlights carved a narrow path through the dark road ahead. Caleb hummed along to a slow country song on the radio, and for the first time all evening, Ethan felt his shoulders begin to relax. "So, what brings you out here?" Caleb asked after a while. "Work trip," Ethan said. "Was heading back to the city." "Guess the car had other plans," Caleb chuckled softly. "Sometimes things break down just to make us stop for a bit." Ethan glanced at him. The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. He turned back to the window, watching the fields slide by under the moonlight. When they reached the ranch, Caleb parked near a small wooden house lit by a single porch light. The place looked peaceful, quiet, surrounded by open land and the distant shapes of horses grazing near the fence line. "Come on in," Caleb said, opening the door. "Coffee's on. You look like you could use something warm." Inside, the air smelled of pine wood and rain. A kettle hissed softly on the stove, and an old clock ticked in the corner. Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one over. Ethan's hands wrapped around it, grateful for the heat. They sat at the small kitchen table. Caleb talked about the ranch, how he'd been running it alone since his brother moved away, how the quiet could be both comforting and lonely. Ethan listened, nodding, feeling the simplicity of the moment settle deep inside him. When Caleb asked about the city, Ethan found himself speaking more honestly than he'd expected. He told him about his work, his engagement, and how lately everything felt like routine without meaning. Caleb didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just listened. By the time the clock struck midnight, the rain had started outside. The sound against the roof was soft and rhythmic. Caleb showed Ethan to a small guest room with a warm blanket and a lamp that glowed amber. "Get some rest," he said from the doorway. "Tomorrow will look better in daylight." Ethan nodded, murmuring a quiet thank you. As he lay in bed, listening to the rain and the distant hum of crickets, his mind replayed Caleb's words. "Sometimes things break down just to make us stop for a bit." He closed his eyes, realizing he hadn't felt this kind of peace in a long time, not since before everything with Ryan had started to change. Outside, the rain fell harder. Inside, the quiet felt safe. Ethan let the sound carry him to sleep, unaware that this night, the one that began in darkness, was about to change something deep within him. Ethan woke to the soft smell of coffee and the sound of birds outside the window. Morning light filtered through the curtains, painting warm stripes across the wooden floor. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then he remembered the night before, the rain, and the man with the calm voice who'd helped him. He sat up slowly, noticing a folded note on the nightstand. "Coffee's on. Help yourself." See, the handwriting was simple, neat. Ethan smiled faintly and followed the smell into the kitchen. Caleb stood by the stove, flipping eggs in a pan, dressed in jeans and a faded shirt that looked older than both of them. He turned when Ethan entered, smiling that same quiet smile. "Morning, city boy. Sleep all right?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Better than I expected. I didn't mean to take over your guest room." "You didn't. Place gets quiet sometimes," Caleb replied. "Nice having someone to talk to." They sat at the table again, the same one from the night before. The conversation came easy, lighter than it had any right to be between near strangers. Caleb talked about the ranch, the endless repairs, the rhythm of work, the beauty of silence. Ethan listened, drinking his coffee slowly, savoring not just the taste, but the calm that came with it. After breakfast, Caleb led him outside. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and bright. The grass glistened, and horses grazed lazily under a wide blue sky. Ethan breathed in deeply. The air smelled like rain and earth. "I almost forgot what quiet felt like," Ethan said softly. Caleb smiled. "It grows on you." They walked toward the barn, where Ethan's car sat near the open doors. Caleb had already set out a few tools, his hands already streaked with grease. "Battery's dead, but I've got one you can borrow," he said. "Might take a bit to get her running again." "I can help," Ethan offered. Caleb gave a teasing grin. "You know your way around an engine?" "Not even a little," Ethan admitted, laughing. "Then you can hand me the tools." "We'll call it teamwork." They worked side by side, sunlight pouring through the barn windows. Every so often, Caleb would explain what he was doing, and Ethan would nod, pretending to understand. They laughed when Ethan handed him the wrong wrench, and for the first time in months, Ethan realized he was smiling without trying to. Around midday, dark clouds rolled in again. A light rain began to fall, pattering against the roof. They stepped inside fully, watching the drizzle turn the world outside silver. Caleb leaned against a wooden post, crossing his arms. "So, what's waiting for you back in the city?" Ethan hesitated. "A fiancé," he said finally. "Ryan. We've been together for 5 years, Caleb nodded, expression unreadable. "That sounds like a long time." "It is," Ethan said quietly. "But lately, I don't know. We talk, but it feels like we're just repeating the same things. We live together, but it's like we're in separate rooms even when we're side by side." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. The rain filled the silence. Finally, he spoke softly. "Sometimes people stay in love because they're afraid of what it means if they stop." Ethan's chest tightened. "Maybe. Or maybe they stay because it's easier than leaving." Caleb glanced at him, eyes steady, kind. Easier doesn't always mean better. They stood there, the air between them heavy but calm. Ethan felt something stir in his chest, an ache, not for Caleb exactly, but for the version of himself that used to believe in simple things. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. Instead, Caleb picked up a small radio from a workbench and turned it on. A quiet country song filled the space, low and melodic. They listened without speaking. The lyrics spoke of open roads and finding home in unexpected places. Ethan's throat felt tight. As the song ended, the rain softened to a mist. Caleb looked toward the open door. Looks like it's clearing up. You'll be back on the road soon. Ethan nodded, but part of him didn't want to leave. Not yet. You ever get tired of being out here alone? He asked. Sometimes, Caleb admitted. But out here you face yourself. No noise, no pretending. He looked at Ethan, then away. You'd be surprised how many people don't really know what they want until the quiet hits them. Ethan swallowed, his pulse uneven. He wanted to tell Caleb that he understood, that he felt that same quiet inside himself every day, even surrounded by city lights. But he didn't. Instead, he just said softly, Maybe that's why I ended up here. Caleb smiled, almost to himself. Maybe so. The rest of the afternoon passed in small, easy moments, fixing the car, talking about little things, the kind of conversation that builds connection without either person noticing it happening. When the sun dipped behind the hills, they sat outside the barn, watching the light fade from gold to violet. Neither spoke for a long while. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was something else, something warm and still. Ethan's phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the moment. The screen lit up with Ryan's name. He stared at it but didn't answer. After a few seconds, the phone went silent again. Caleb didn't ask. He just said quietly, Sometimes, no answer is an answer. Ethan looked up at the sky. The stars were starting to appear, faint and patient. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. The morning came quietly, soft light spilling through the barn's open door. The rain had passed, leaving the fields shimmering with dew. Ethan stood outside, breathing in the cool air, watching as Caleb tightened the last bolt under the hood of his car. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen again, but this time it felt different, bittersweet. She's good to go, Caleb said, wiping his hands on a rag. Battery's holding charge now. Should get you home without trouble. Ethan nodded slowly. You really didn't have to do all this. Caleb gave a half smile. Didn't mind. Kind of nice having someone around for a change. There was an awkward pause, not from discomfort, but from the weight of unspoken things. The kind that hangs in the air when two people know something important has shifted, but can't quite name it. Ethan looked out toward the open fields, endless and bright beneath the morning sun. You ever think about leaving? He asked softly. Caleb followed his gaze. Sometimes, but every time I think about it, I remember. There's peace in staying still. The world's always moving, but out here you can actually feel it instead of chasing it. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. I used to think I needed to keep moving to feel alive. Now I just feel tired. Caleb studied him for a long moment. Maybe you're just moving in the wrong direction. The words hit deeper than Ethan expected. He looked down at his hands, noticing the faint marks from the tools they'd used the day before. It felt symbolic, proof of something real, something that didn't exist behind office walls and endless arguments. After breakfast, they loaded the last of Ethan's things into the car. The quiet between them was soft but heavy. Caleb leaned against the doorframe while Ethan lingered by the driver's side, stalling in small ways, checking the mirror, adjusting the seat, pretending he wasn't just delaying the inevitable. Finally, Ethan turned to him. I don't really know how to say thank you. For everything, Caleb shrugged lightly. You don't have to. Some folks just cross paths when they need to. Ethan smiled faintly. Do you believe that? Caleb's eyes met his. I do now. They stood there for a moment that felt longer than it was. No music, no words, just the wind moving through the grass. Then Caleb reached up, tipping his hat slightly. Take care of yourself, Ethan. You've got more heart than you think. Ethan wanted to say something back, something meaningful enough to fit the moment, but all he managed was a quiet, you too. Caleb, as he drove down the long dirt road, the ranch disappeared slowly in the rearview mirror. For a while, he didn't turn on the radio. He just listened to the hum of the engine and the whisper of the wind through the open window. The world felt wide again, but not empty. When his phone finally picked up a signal, it vibrated nonstop. Calls, messages, all from Ryan. Ethan stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the button, but he didn't answer. Not yet. He needed space to think, to breathe. He pulled over at a small overlook halfway between the ranch and the city. The view stretched for miles, green fields meeting distant hills, sky melting into horizon. He leaned against the car and let himself just exist. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel trapped between choices. He simply felt present. When he finally drove into the city that afternoon, the skyline rose ahead, sharp and familiar. The sound of traffic filled the air again, but it didn't drown out the quiet inside him. At home, Ryan was waiting by the door, relief flashing across his face. "You didn't answer your phone," Ryan said, his tone caught between worry and irritation. "I know," Ethan replied calmly. "I needed some time." Ryan reached out to hug him, and Ethan let him, but it felt different, distant. They talked for a while, but the words felt practiced, careful. Ryan apologized for the argument, said he'd been stressed, promised things would be different. Ethan nodded, but deep down, something had shifted. Later that night, when Ryan had gone to bed, Ethan sat by his desk, sketching on a blank page. Without thinking, his pencil began to trace the outline of a small cabin surrounded by open land. Something simple, quiet, peaceful. At the bottom of the page, he wrote a name: Second Chances. He stared at the words for a long time, then smiled faintly. He wasn't sure what they meant yet. Maybe a new project, maybe something more personal. But they felt right. Outside, the city lights flickered against the window pane. Ethan closed his notebook, leaned back in his chair, and thought of Caleb's words. Some folks just cross paths when they need to. Maybe that was all this was, a moment meant to remind him of who he was, of what it meant to feel alive again. He didn't know if he'd ever see Caleb again. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But as he turned off the lamp and sat in the glow of the city night, Ethan realized something he hadn't known when the week began. Love wasn't just about holding on. Sometimes it was about learning when to let go and finding yourself in the quiet after.